So we're talking about the role of the narrator is
Yes.
helping us in the historical books. Now, a narrator, I'm thinking about the difference between, say, a narrator and a news reporter. You know, a news reporter is kind of telling us, you know, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened.
Right.
And the news reporter is kind of neutral. They're just kind of saying what happened.
Yeah.
Whereas when I think of a narrator, I think of them telling a story for a purpose. So maybe you could say something about, I mean, we call these historical books, but if it's a narrator, not a news reporter, then they would have a certain kind of a history, wouldn't they?
Yes.
So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, very important. One of the things we have to do is we have to understand the nature of narrative. And this might be a little bit new to some people, and maybe even a bit difficult to grasp. Narrative stories are, the best way to describe them is to use Adele Berlin's term, and that is they are representational art. They are not the actual thing itself. They are an artistic representation of that thing. Meaning, what I mean by that is, what the narrator does is he uses, just for example, just like an artist might use, let's say, an apple to create a drawing of the apple. Once a drawing of the apple is done, that's what narrative equals. And we all know that when we look at the drawing of the apple, it's not a real apple. If you cut the drawing, you're not going to get juice, and you're not going to be able to eat the drawing. And so what we have in narrative is an artistic representation of the events that took place. They are not the actual events themselves. I hope people get the difference between that. We will never know what actually happened in the Valley of Elah when David and Goliath met. We just do not know, because we cannot take a machine and go back in time and plank ourselves in the thing to see it ourselves. What we have is a drawing, as it were, of what took place. And here's the thing about artistic representations. If you had a room full of people and you put an apple on a table and said, draw it, some people will draw it to scale, some people will draw it 10 times more, some people will draw it in black and white, some people will draw it in color, depending on their own purposes. And that is the case with the narrators as well. They have taken these events and they have put them together in order to make a point. And in making that point, they will emphasize some aspects of the story, and they may not other aspects of the story. So it's very important to keep that in mind, that we have no access to the actual historical event. What we have is the artistic depiction of that event. And it is artistically depicted. It is not straightforward. Like you said, the news report, even though modern news reporters seem to have a different agenda, but a good news reporter just gives you the facts and that's it. And leaves the moralizing or the, what can you say, they should not have any other agenda, commentary, than to actually tell you what happened and let you make up your mind about it. The narrator has no such constraint. All of the stories that they choose to tell, they tell it because they have a massive agenda. They have a point to prove, and they are only going to pick and choose those stories, and they're going to depict them in a certain way in order to convince you of that doctrine. So what is the overall major doctrine that they want to convince you of? The best term I know of is ethical monotheism. Ethical monotheism. That is the point they want to make.
Ethical
monotheism.
Now that's a mouthful.
Yes, it's a fairly simple thing, and that is there is one God.
One God.
Who rules his world through ethics. Who rules his world through moral law. And that moral law is inviolable. You will not get away if you violate it. That is the major doctrine that they're trying to teach. And so their stories will depict how people relate to that great moral principle. And you will see people who accept that principle, characters in their story who accept that principle and do well. You'll see characters who buck it and pay for it in the end. But one way or the other, ethical monotheism will either uphold you or it will crush you. And that major theme is given through the whole narrative. So we see people who live in accordance with it. People like, let's say, Joseph is a character that pretty much constantly lives within those constraints. But we see Judah trying to buck it with his marriages and so forth. We see Jacob trying to buck it. We see David. You know, most of his early life he lived it, but then at a certain point he tried to buck it. But in the end, he also was crushed by it and humbled by it. So that is their major doctrine. It's the ethical monotheism, and they pick and choose their stories in order to point the reader in that direction and let them know that there is a God, and he rules his world through his righteous law, and you'd best come under that and submit to it if you want to have a happy and successful life.
So we're not saying, though, and you can help me with this, we're not saying that the stories of the historical books are just made up stories like a parable.
Right.
But we're also not saying that they're, you know, like a play-by-play,
Right.
something in between those two, or
Yeah.
or how would you say?
Yeah, probably something in between those two. The narrative, we having studied narrative, we can tell that the narrative has three concerns, and they're all co-equal to him. One is ideology. He wants to convey ideology. He is not neutral. He wants you to come to believe.
He's got some ideas that he wants to get
absolutely.
across.
He wants to get across his ideology, and that is there is a God, and you should come under him and accept his moral law. So ideology is one of the concerns. The second concern is history. They're absolutely concerned with history. Especially Israel is obsessed with history. Israel's whole existence depends on a God who acts within history to choose her and to deliver her and to keep her going. And the way the authors show concern for this particular concern is by connecting the story to coordinating the story with other events. They'll say, well, this happened when that king was ruling. They will connect it to monuments, you know, and they set up this monument, and it is there to this day. You can go and check it out. They have genealogies that trace the ancestry and so forth. So it's very clearly historically grounded. So that's the second concern.
But they're not telling us everything that happened. They're
Absolutely not.
selecting those
Exactly.
things, so there could be big gaps.
Big, huge gaps.
But those aren't mistakes. They're
No.
gapping,
Yeah.
leaving gaps on purpose.
On
Because they
purpose, yeah.
want to
They wanna move
emphasize
on.
their idea,
For sure.
their point. Okay.
Exactly. And then the third concern is, so they have history, ideology, and the third one is art. Art. They want to create something beautiful. And so they depict it using art. These are some of the most sophisticated. Now, I've been studying this stuff for probably 20 years, and I am blown away by the sophistication. We tend to think, oh, those authors back then, what did they know? And I tell you, these are some of the most amazing, sophisticated authors that you will ever read. And the biblical literature, this narrative is on par with the Iliad or the Odyssey or anything of that caliber. I had a friend who was once at a conference, and at this conference was a Milton scholar. And they became friends, and the Milton scholar...
A militant?
Milton.
Milton.
John Milton.
The
Great British
Sure.
author and poet. And so he invited my friend to study Milton. He said, would you like to read Milton with me? And my friend said, absolutely, you're the world expert on Milton. I would love to sit down. And so they started reading, and the Milton scholar was amazed at the insight and understanding that my friend had. And he said to him, he said, where did you learn how to read Milton? He said, where do you think Milton learned to write? He had been a biblical scholar, and he had studied the narrative literature of the Bible, and so he could see that Milton was just imitating, mimicking so much of the characteristics of the biblical authors. This is high stuff. Now, I should say something that you pointed out. We have no independent access to the story, and so we are completely dependent on the author. We already know this from the New Testament, because if you read the end of John, he will tell you, look, I could not write everything that Jesus said and did. And if I were to give you everything that Jesus said and did, the whole world could not contain the books that could be written. Now, right there, he's giving you a big clue. But I've had to leave a lot of the stories on the floor. And I've only given you a small sampling of what Jesus did. Then the question is, well, on what basis did you choose? Like, how did you choose to leave off one story and give you another story? You have to get on his agenda. What point is he trying to make? And he's only going to pick those stories out of Jesus' life that make his point. And the other stories, much as we would like to have them, he has to leave behind. So these are the authors. They pick and choose the events that they want to, that will contribute and support and argue their point. And the others, sadly, are left behind. And that's just the way it is. We are at their mercy. So the next thing, I guess, to talk about is a little bit about this narrator. We are so dependent upon him. What kind of a person is he? Well, we can say at least three things about this narrator. They appear to be omniscient and omnipotent. Now remember, the narrator is not God.
And you have to define those words for us.
Okay.
Okay.
He knows everything.
Omniscient.
Omniscient, knows everything.
Knows
and
everything.
omnipresence, he's everywhere. I should say omnipresent.
Okay.
They're everywhere. At one moment they're on earth in some room. The next minute they're with God in the heavenlies, describing what God is talking about. One minute he's on one battlefield. The next minute he's in David's bedroom, observing what's going on there. So how does he travel so on forth? And actually the narrative will tell you what God is thinking. What God is thinking. And the Lord said to himself, I am sorry that I made humans, Genesis chapter 6. And I think, how does he know that? Who is this fellow? He appears to be omniscient and omnipresent. He's all over the place. He's in the bedroom with when David's son, which one is it? That's raping Tamar. You know, his Adonijah. No, not Adonijah. The other one of the sons is. When in fact we are told that the fellow thrust out everybody out of the room and shut the door so that he could have his way with Tamar. But he's there listening to everything that happens. So he's omniscient and omnipresent. Secondly, he does intervene into the story. Very rarely, but he does do that.
He jumps.
He jumps into the story.
He jumps onto the stage.
He jumps onto the stage. For example, there's a good example of this in 2 Samuel chapter 11. This is the story of David calculating and plotting and carrying out the seduction of Bathsheba and then the horrible murder of her husband. And the story is told exactly as it is happening. We see these events going on, and we see David sending and bringing and all of this stuff and going on, and we are wondering what's going on here. And we are wondering, as David is doing all this, isn't there anybody that's saying to him, look, you should not be doing this. Like, what are you thinking, man? Nothing. It's just... But then suddenly, at the end of it, we read this statement, and we go. It's in the last verse of 2 Samuel chapter 11. But the thing that David did displeased the Lord. And we go, who is that? Who just made that comment? Whammo, he jumps into the story. And you will see other times as well, he'll be telling the story, and then he will say, for example, and you will read, this was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord in order to fulfill his prophecy or statement or word that he gave to somebody else, and you go, that's a narrator intervening into the story. So the question then is, why does he intervene? Most of the time, he's happy to tell the story and stay off the stage. Why does he intervene? Primarily, he intervenes when there is a possibility that the reader could go wrong in the story, in interpreting the story, and getting the wrong message out of the story. Then he will intervene to keep the reader straight. For example, in this story about David carrying on this affair, people might look at it and say, you know what? Yeah, that's not the best thing to do, but he's the king. You know, he's the king. And maybe he has the authority and the power to do that. After all, kings are gods. And if you, especially if you had a view of kingship as the surrounding cultures where the king actually was, or the representative of God, maybe you can do that. You can take another man's wife, and if he makes a fuss about it, you can kill him. And so, lest people get that idea, because Israel was supposed to have a different kind of king, a covenant-keeping king. And here is David acting like a tyrant, like a oriental tyrant. He steps in to say, no, no, no. Don't get me wrong. Don't get this wrong. The thing that David did is despised by the Lord. And so he comes in to keep you straight. And in that way, the narrator always speaks for God. He gives you the authoritative viewpoint. And if he says something, you can take it to the bank. It's true. Characters might say this and characters might say that. But if the narrator says something, that is the true authoritative divine point of view. How do we know this? Let me ask you this simple question. How did Saul actually die in the end? We have two versions. You know? One version, which is in 1 Samuel 31, Saul, he's been given a mortal blow, but he's still lingering in between life and death. And so he asks his armor bearer, you know, take your sword and run me through. The armor bearer refuses, and so Saul kills himself. We turn the page, and you read about this character that comes running to David, this Amalekite. And he's bringing, I think, the crown of Saul to David. And David says, what happened? Oh, this is what happened. Saul was between life and death, and he asked me who I am, and I said, I'm a Amalekite, and he said, please, release me, I need to die. So I took my sword, and I thrust him through. And I took his crown, and I bring it to you, my Lord. Now, clearly, the Amalekite wants a reward. He wants to get on David's good side, hoping David will reward him. For he probably knew that David and Saul were arch enemies, and so here it is.
So he thought killing Saul would be a good thing that David would be pleased about.
But the question we are left with, well, how did Saul die? We have two accounts. How do we decide? This is where the narrative will help us. The first account is given by the narrator, narrating it. Right? Saul asked his armor bearer. No, he took his own. The second is coming from a character. I ran Saul through. You always go with the narrator. That's the correct version. Saul died at his own hand. He committed suicide, as the narrator tells us. The Amalekite is lying to get a reward.
He's making this up.
He is making it up. Yeah. And so the interesting thing is, he was killed for a lie, right? Because David actually believed that he had killed Saul and executed him, because David was not that kind of a person.
And maybe just to sum up as well, you know, we're talking about the authors and their intent. Of course, as Christians as well,
yes,
we look to God himself and say, God also is superintending this process,
yes,
so that this text, as it is, even with these two versions, the lying Amalekite and the,
right.
So this is what we were meant to have, and all of these interesting twists and sometimes challenges are there on purpose, and they're meant to help us as we read the Bible.
Yes. And the way we make sense of them is by understanding the way the narrative works, and that's what we're doing here.